So the second session will be chaired by Professor Jim Holyfield, who is the director of the Tower Center at SMU and a very accomplished scholar. So Professor Holyfield, over to you to chair this session on Israel, Gaza, and a sustainable end to it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. And let me again welcome you all to this event. A lot of you probably don't know what the Tower Center is. I've traveled, spoken all over the world. Most people think that we're in a gigantic tower somewhere. We're at Ivory Tower, I guess, but the Tower Center was created in honor of the former senator from Texas, John Tower. Some of you, like me, might be barely old enough to remember him. Along with Senator Scoop Jackson from Washington, Tower and Jackson basically ran the Cold War for about 30, 40 years. So Tower he wasn't a very tall guy, but he was a giant in the field of foreign policy, defense, and security. So I know he would be pleased to see us here collaborating with the Middle East Institute. Thanks to Paul and Ray, we have a long history of collaboration, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my vice chair, Ambassador Robert Jordan, who was our diplomat in residence, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and a great expert on the Middle East. I want to start this panel just on a very brief personal note. At SMU, I have a chair in international political economy, so I'm more of an economist in a way than an international relations scholar. But we're always drawn, if you will, from the more peaceful side of international relations to these issues of conflict and war and peace. None of you in here would know that I started my career studying the Middle East somewhere around 1975. I was a graduate student in France, and I just found it so depressing. After a couple of years, I shifted my focus actually to Europe. And we've heard the word pivot. Everybody in here, we talked about proxies. I think we should ban the word pivot from American foreign policy. I was giving a talk at the Hoover Institution a few years ago, and the late Secretary of State George Shultz was my host. He was 99 years old at the time. And I said, Secretary Shultz, what do you think about this idea of pivoting to Asia? And I'll never forget his response was, we pivoted to Asia and the Russians invaded Ukraine. So pivoting away from the Middle East. I had to pivot as well to study Europe. But no matter which way I have turned throughout my career, especially being a migration scholar, expert in Europe, the Middle East is always there. It's right in the middle of the road. You just can't avoid it. You can't get around it. One final personal note before I introduce the panel. On October the 7th, I was in Paris and staying with some friends, and I had to give a speech in Geneva on October the 9th at the Graduate Institute, and a very large audience, and about a dozen Palestinian students in the audience. And of course, their question to me is, what do we do? Where do we go now? And I said, well, at least you have UNRWA, I said, which turned out not to be a very good reassurance, I guess. So as an IR scholar, what I want to do in this panel is I want us to open up a little bit the black box of the state. I really think we have to look at what's going on in the domestic politics of a lot of these countries. And of course, hopefully this will get us to understand better the position of the players in the conflict. So this panel is devoted to silencing the guns, I think. Never an easy task for any diplomat. But could each of you, and first of all, let me introduce you. I'm like Sabri, I was I forgot that I have to do the introduction too. So I know everybody knows our panelists, but let me just say that we have Brian Katulis, who is a senior fellow for U.S. foreign policy here at the Middle East Institute. I'm assuming a lot of you know him. I wasn't given a bio in advance. And the other guest is Khalid El-Gindi, who's a senior fellow and director of Palestine and Palestinian Israeli Affairs program, also here at the Middle East Institute. So could you, each of you, tell us what is the current state of play? You know, where are we right now in terms of the negotiations? You know, Blinken is off trying again to get the parties together. Could you just explain to us where we are right now?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I guess I'll get us started. Where we are is pretty much where we've been for the past several months. And particularly, I guess since the start of the year, we're right on the verge of some imminent ceasefire deal that never seems to come. And I think we're, obviously we're still in that moment. What is on the table is some sort of temporary ceasefire, 6 weeks or so, but that at least U.S. officials are hoping will be prolonged into something more durable. That's the language that they use. And it would entail a kind of staged release of hostages, currently Israeli hostages being held in Gaza, in addition to some number of Palestinian prisoners who would be released in return. And we've been there really now for several months. I'm not terribly optimistic about prospects for a breakthrough. I think the incentive structure, both for Hamas and for the Israeli leadership, hasn't really changed. I think their calculus hasn't changed. Washington's position hasn't really changed much at all, really, since October 7th. And the reality on the ground is one that is actually catastrophic. So if there is one thing that is creating a sense of urgency, it is that. It's the fact that you now have starvation on a mass scale. You have famine that has already reached the north. You have, in addition to the 35,000 who've been killed, Gaza's been destroyed, essentially, its civilian infrastructure, all of its universities, most of its hospitals. Between 60 and 80% of Gaza's homes have been destroyed. Most of the structures have been destroyed. I mean, this has been a complete war of mass destruction. And quite deliberately, right? This isn't accidental. It's not the Israeli IDF didn't destroy all of Gaza's universities on accident. It's not collateral damage. The fact that 1.5 million people are in a state of catastrophic levels of starvation, also not an accident. And so here we are with really no end in sight. The administration has said that what's on the table is basically the best offer that Hamas will ever get. Although, as the weeks grind on, the offer seems to get a little bit better. I think that has to do with American impatience more than the Israelis. I think the Israeli side has an enormous appetite for continuing. We hear from Prime Minister Netanyahu that even if we have a temporary ceasefire agreed to, he's still going to go ahead with the Rafah operation, which pretty much everyone says would be even more catastrophic than what we've seen so far. In all of the major cities, the IDF has gone in and essentially destroyed them. They've leveled them to the ground. Rafah has the added fact that most of Gaza's population has been displaced there. So there's a real fear that any operation in Rafah will not only have an enormous civilian toll in the thousands, many thousands, maybe even I've seen estimates of like maybe 10 or more thousand. There is a very real risk of forced displacement outside of Gaza into Egypt. So we're we're still pretty much where we've been, and there really doesn't seem to be any end in sight. And the last thing I'll say is that even if the war were to end today, even if there was a ceasefire deal that ended the war and it became a de facto sustained ceasefire, the lasting effects of what has been done will remain for decades. We're talking really about another generation or more of instability, certainly of mass trauma, frankly, even in human terms. The disease and starvation will take a toll, gradual toll over time, not to mention the long and medium term health effects, not to mention mental health effects of what's been happening. So it's really quite a bleak picture, and it's just, there is no end in sight. Though unfortunately, it's a very grim
I think he turned it on.
reality, but here we are.
Yeah. Brian?
First, two things I wanted to say. A warm welcome to all of you, especially y'all from Texas. Did I sound authentic there?
If I was from Texas A&M, I would say howdy, but I'll spare it.
I also want to acknowledge something that pains Khaled and I, at least. I don't know. We're a mantle, and I'm sorry for that. It's not for a lack of trying. Sometimes scheduling doesn't work, but we have so many friends and colleagues who are distinguished scholars who we wish we had the diversity on gender here. Not to self-flagellate too much, but it just happens that way. Look, Blinken's done. This trip is over. It's his 7th trip to the Middle East. I'm going to focus my remarks on U.S. policy because I think Khaled painted an accurate picture, and it's not a hopeful one, and I don't disagree with it. Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, I think is engaged maybe what I've called uncharitably shuffle diplomacy. So if you remember, Henry Kissinger, after the '73 war, engaged in shuttle diplomacy, which actually had a big theory of the case about the region. I think actually helped set a framework for what Israel and Egypt ultimately did, but it also had an eye to what was going on geopolitically. It operated at multiple levels. And if I have a constructive critique, big picture on US foreign policy today, is yes, we do have these things like a US national security strategy document. It's a document. But I actually don't think the problem of today's Middle East is well articulated and understood in the context of what's going on geopolitically. To the point I think, James, you were trying to make on pivot, right? Mm-hmm. And I could say a little bit about that later. Mm-hmm. But briefly, snapshot where we're at in U.S. policy is 3 basic steps I think the Biden team has on its head, in its mind, about what it wants to do on this, and then 3 pitfalls that I think can upset it. The first step is what Khaled talked about, this hoped for temporary ceasefire, 6 weeks, 40 days, exchange of prisoners that would be released from Israeli prisons, Palestinians, and some number of hostages. The number of hostages that would be released has gone down, as Khaled indicated, because of shifting and negotiating positions. Much of US policy, I would say all of the approach is dependent on that. That's step 1, and they've been trying more or less since the last ceasefire ended, right? And there'll be an interesting paper to be written about these negotiations and what people were really talking about, because it wasn't just about prisoners and hostages and temporary ceasefire. It was essentially a negotiation about the off-ramp, which is the second step. The administration hopes that if you get to this temporary ceasefire, they can then build a ramp or a bridge to wider diplomacy, which they've begun. Blinken, when in Saudi Arabia, did many things. The second step means engaging Arab partners to talk about the day after, getting them to come up with a formula for governance, reconstruction, security, yada, yada, yada. Third step, which is still out there and it's sort of concurrent, is this idea, much of it was discussed pre-10/7, the notion that there might be an opening for an Israel-Saudi normalization, regional integration, the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor that was announced at the G20 in September. So those are the 3 steps, concurrent, they're trying to work it, but it's heavily dependent on number 1. Because if combat operations that kill thousands of Palestinians more are ongoing, I don't think you get step 2 or 3. The 3 big roadblocks to conclude, I think, and Secretary Blinken just experienced it again, is number 1, Israel and its government, and not just its leader, but if you think about even just the terms of the ceasefire, in the run-up to this, there's not only the negotiation that the Qataris and the Egyptians are trying to do between Hamas and Israel, there's a negotiation inside of Israel, which has several cabinet ministers that just reject the notion of even a ceasefire. They're insisting on military operations. It has other cabinet ministers that are insisting on a ceasefire. So there could be an interesting point inside of Israel, but it's a break point. And my view is that even if Netanyahu is removed from office, the center of gravity in Israeli politics is not far off from where its policies really are, right? And we'll get into leverage and questions like this. That's one sort of roadblock. 2 is Hamas itself, quite clearly. We can get into that, but it's often ignored in our debates here, in the heated debates about the role that Hamas continues to play to try to hold on to power, much to the chagrin, I would say, to many Palestinians in Gaza. Both Khaled and I I used to live and work in Gaza, actually, in the 1990s, so we have many dear friends there. And the simple fact is Hamas, though it rose in popularity in opinion polls, people who live there, who have to live with this situation, it's pretty bad. And then the third factor, which is often ignored on the Arab-Israel issue, but is, I think, a real big factor, and it was the topic of the previous panel, which is Iran, and the role that Iran actually plays and its so-called axis of resistance in shaping the broader security conditions in the Middle East, which I think complicate a lot of what the U.S. Aims to do. So those are big problems there. So, and maybe it's unfair for me to say that Blinken's doing shuffle diplomacy, shuffling around without a map, because there's so many complicated pictures here. And if the U.S. doesn't engage more in a clear way, then I think it could even get worse. But if it pulls back, I think it's even more disastrous.
Okay, well, you, like every good speaker, you've answered almost all my questions here before.
All right.
Before I move on to the next question, but I want to press you, both of you, a little bit on this issue of the negotiations, and I'd like to hear, who do you think the players, the principal players are? I would identify 4, basically. One is Israel, one is the United States, one is Iran, and then there's, the Arab-Palestinian front, which has many different dimensions to it. But if you look at these players, and you can add or subtract to the list if you want, each of them, do they have an end game? Where do they want to end up? I'd like to hear. I mean, you can pick which players you want to focus on, but I think we heard a lot about Iran in the previous panel. I want to hear more about Israel. You've already alluded to this, but what's the end game here?
Maybe go ahead. Yeah, I'll jump in and maybe pick what you termed sort of the Arab group, because though fractious, it's quite more unified on this issue. And a few of us were in Saudi Arabia last week and sort of heard it from what I view to be the more predominant power these days in the Arab world. And I think their point on has been fairly clear. They have lobbied at the UN and a number of Arab states for not just a temporary ceasefire, but they want the war to end. They're also willing to contribute to reconstruction and some sort of governance scenario. I think it was debatable, but I think the door is now more open about how do you keep Gaza secure? Because one of the big problems, there are many problems with Israel's military operation right now, but the fact that there's no law and order, even if we were to get more aid channels into there, if you remember what happened with the trucks that went in about a month or so ago and 100 people were killed because they were run over and shot. If you don't have order in the Gaza Strip itself, it's hard to distribute much needed aid to starving people who are desperate, right? And you need some sort of order there. I think some of the Arab states would open the door to that, but what we heard in Saudi Arabia in particular, there has to be a state of Palestine. There has to be a clear, time-bound idea of a creation of the state of Palestine, which, going back to these conundrums and the current Israeli government, I think Khaled would argue successive Israeli governments before it have opposed the creation of the state of Palestine. There also, what I think is interesting is in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the ones that will be asked by the US, if we get to that hopeful stage of building rather than war, to be the ATMs, they're going to have actually higher standards for delivering money and assistance to the Palestinians. And it's in part connected to how they see themselves in their own economic models, reform of their own economic models. And it's why they don't give money to Lebanon all that much these days. Because as one of them said to us last week, we don't want that money to be building villas in southern France like it did for decades. So there's going to be, and I'll conclude here, for US policymakers, whoever wins this election, whoever's in government, the shift that I don't think anyone's ready for, and nobody's really talking about, even in the protests and all of this, is that there needs to be an elevation of the US engagement with Palestinians directly, with the Palestinian Authority, with the PLO. It has to even be higher than when it was in the 1990s when Khaled, you and I were working on the issues. Because I don't think that any scenario won't work. But as Khaled writes in his book, for decades, the US-Palestinian relationship has always been a subsidiary to the US-Israel relationship. And as far as I can see politics here in this country and policy, we're nowhere close to being to a state where there's political coalitions that are built to actually support a robust effort to support the creation of a state of Palestine. You have a lot of energy, which is dedicated to trying to stop a war and trying to oppose actions right now. But that's a different thing than what do you actually want to help achieve? And that's a very long-term process.
The end game, end games, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, Brian gave a very good summary in terms of the regional dynamics. So I'll focus a little bit on what I see as Israeli and Hamas endgames as the two primary belligerents on the ground. I should start off by saying we don't really know. I mean, we're all kind of divining and kind of reading between the lines but I think there's something that can be said. We don't have a clear idea of either side's endgames. On the Israeli side, I would say the endgame, you have to look at realities on the ground more than the statements of their leaders, but actually the two are very much in sync with one another. Gaza has been made to a very large extent uninhabitable. Again, this is not accidental. I think we have to assume this is part of the Israeli vision. This is part of the end game. Netanyahu has called it thinning out the population, which is not an unrealistic expectation. When you imagine, I don't expect the entire 2.3 million people to be pushed out of Gaza. Certainly not all at once, but there would be a significant reduction in the population because over time, even when the guns fall silent, there's just people don't have homes to go back to. They don't have schools. They don't have hospitals, right? The institutions and infrastructure that support life don't exist for the most part in Gaza anymore. So I think we would expect to see an exodus, even a slow one, over the next decade or so. So I think that's part of Israel's endgame, to make Gaza, to thin out the population as much as possible, and then whatever is left, there won't be major cities, right? Gaza City has been destroyed, Khan Yunis has been destroyed, and Rafah is probably next. There will remain a population of some sort in Gaza. The Israeli vision is that you would have some sort of local governance, security forces that are kind of parochial, local notables, mukhtars, or business leaders, or gangs, or whatever, tribal leaders. I think that is the sort of vision that Israel has. Anything that is not a national leadership, right? They're adamantly opposed, obviously can't be Hamas, but also the Palestinian Authority. The Israelis have said no return of the PA to Gaza, right? So anything that smacks of a Palestinian national leadership, especially a nationalist one, that is off the table as far as Israel is concerned. And they will cultivate these other kinds of, some of you may, if you're familiar with the 1980s, Israel pushed this idea of the village leagues. They would have these kind of local leaderships who were not nationalistic, apolitical, and who were very responsive either for reasons of self-interest or out of coercion to Israeli military leaders. So I think that's the general vision. Of course, completely incompatible with the United States' vision for the return of the PA, and but never mind that. I think Hamas's endgames are maybe even more simple to divine, and that is they're trying to survive. They're trying to simply continue to exist, right? To deny, and that's one of the reasons why I think this war has gone on for as long as it has. Israel has set the goal of eradicating Hamas. This is not an achievable goal. You can destroy all of Gaza, which they've done, but you can't destroy a political movement through bombs. There is a kind of mixed bag that Hamas has in some ways gotten a boost to its popularity since October 7th, particularly outside of Gaza, in the West Bank, in the diaspora. I think for Gaza Palestinians, one, it's much harder to actually gauge public opinion in the moment because of everything that's going on. But I think we can assume that there is a fair amount of discontent with Hamas's decision-making, both October 7th and everything that's happened since. And then the longer this goes on, I would expect that discontent to grow. It's hard to quantify. We just don't have the ability to do that. But it will survive in some form. They would like to survive as both a political and a military force. But I think it's safe to assume that they will survive as they will be politically relevant. And I think that's it. I think really that's the full extent of what Hamas's endgame is.
Yeah, if I could just jump in here too, the Abraham Accords. I mean, it seems to me the premise of the Abraham Accords was to ignore the Palestinians, basically, bypass the Palestinians. So my question to both of you, are the Abraham Accords a dead letter?
Well, I mean, Brian just made the point about Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Abraham Accords, as they exist, I think, are not a dead letter. They have endured. The agreements that were signed with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan is, I think, a very different category. But just looking at those three states, those agreements haven't collapsed. There's been minimal damage on the bilateral tracks of those. I think where the Abraham Accords has taken a major hit is in its expansion, right? Particularly with regard to Saudi Arabia. I don't see the Saudis joining on anytime soon, certainly not in this context. That doesn't seem to be the view of the administration. They seem, sort of strangely optimistic that they can clinch a deal with the Saudis before their term is up. But I think everything is frozen, essentially.
Yeah, I would have renamed the Abraham Accords the coming out of the closet Accords, because these are relationships that were actually quite quiet and underneath the surface, and then it was surfaced at a time that was fortuitous. The one minor benefit it had for the Palestinians, and I'm going to highlight minor, is if you recall, the Israeli government at the time was planning to annex part of the West Bank, and this was essentially part of the rationale was these deals would actually block that, but for a time-limited period of time. I see the Abraham Accords as yet another example of Arab countries not negotiating as strongly as they could to get a better deal. And it's part of sort of Israel's separate pieces with Egypt, Jordan, and this is where I think the missing link has been for a while. If you recall back in 1991 at Madrid, and the idea of a big comprehensive peace. Israel's strategy has been to try to create separate pieces. I suspect that the Saudis' price will be much, much, much higher for a lot of this. And there's two tracks. There's the Israel-Saudi, but then there's a number of agreements that are linked between the United States and Saudi Arabia. I'm skeptical, though, as Khaled mentioned, it's not shared inside parts of the White House. I'm skeptical that the pieces of the Rubik's Cube will line up. In fact, the hope is in the next few weeks. And I think it's fantasy land. Maybe I'll be wrong. But I do think that it almost seems, it's really dependent on what happens with Palestine and the Palestinians, but it almost seems necessary to move forward.
Yep. I have two final questions, and we only have a few minutes to address these. Maybe they'll come up again during the discussion. But one of my colleagues, Mr. Rafidi, wanted me to ask you about the Arab Street. Does it even exist, I guess? But maybe we can address that quickly. But the big question also I want to end with is, where is the U.S.? What leverage do we have in this situation? And if we have such leverage, will we be able to use it? Once we've addressed this, and we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, just real quick on the question of the Arab Street. I think the Arab public opinion exists and it matters. It's currently, I think we can't underestimate the impact of repression in subduing that public opinion and ensuring that it's not vocalized. We've seen this particularly in Egypt. Egypt being not only the most populous Arab state, but the one that has the greatest stake directly in what happens in Gaza. There's enormous public anger at Israel, at the United States, and by extension at their own regime. But the regime has done a good job of kind of clamping down and preventing any space from opening up. Very early on, I think in October, November, there were mass protests in Cairo, Tahrir Square, and people started, talking about, well, these are the largest protests since the uprising there more than a decade ago. But that has been snuffed out. Where we are seeing more regular public expressions is in Jordan. But underneath the surface, there is this public opinion that is, I think, acting as that constraint. I think if it were up to one man, Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudis would have a deal with Israelis, regardless of what happens. But he understands that you can't completely ignore Saudi public opinion, I think.
U.S. leverage?
It exists, but I think it's often overstated. And this is my view, and probably not a popular one. But the actors, the main combatants, as we talked about, how hard it is to get to a temporary ceasefire, they're going to be responsive to two primary things: the security conditions that they and their people are facing. And here in the case of Israel, it's awful, right? It's still objectively, certainly not as bad as what Palestinians are facing, but on a near daily basis. Just on Monday, more rockets from Lebanon coming from Hamas. This sense of a siege mentality that has shifted inside of Israel. So Israel's leaders, whether it's Netanyahu or whomever comes after him, will be responsive to those security conditions. And then second, to the political pressures that come from within. So where I think the debate here is mostly about, well, if you just cut off the aid, and I know Khaled and I may have a slightly different view on this, then that will read the Israelis the Riot Act. And they'll be like, okay, we get it. We can't protect our citizens, and we won't pursue these operations. I do think there's an attempt at very minor at leverage to sanction some settlers and name out some units, but it's so small, and it sort of sends a contradictory message. If you looked at Biden's call with Netanyahu on Sunday, his first thing is ironclad, the ironclad commitment to Israel's security. But then there's attempts which are very tactical and modest and marginal to try to shape the actions, but it's not a unified diplomatic approach. Where I think, on the last bit, where I think there's some potential missed opportunity for leverage is for the U.S. to actually form a regional coalition. And I've written about this before. I think what Blinken's missing, and I've suggested this to his team, but I just think they don't want to do so much on the Middle East, which is another. They're focused on Asia and Ukraine and other things, is that they should form, like they did in previous eras, the U.S. governments, a regional coalition that actually marshals in a more organized way a unified voice. If we're serious about the creation of a state of Palestine, it's better for us to say that in lockstep with some of our close Arab partners and essentially say this is what needs to happen. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that can activate Israeli internal political discussions in a way that's much more meaningful than the things that people are proposing at protests and college campuses and things like that, that actually leads to some more progress for Palestinians. But that's just my view.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about the American streets and whether whether these protests will have any real effect on administration policy. But I think we better open it up for questions now. And please raise your hand and wait for the microphone since this is being recorded. Who would like to start? This gentleman right here, and then we'll move to Sabri. Can you introduce yourself too?
Colin Winston. Let's assume that Israel does not go into Rafah, that Hamas retains its forces there and the leaders of those forces are there. Maybe the hostages are released. But under that scenario, how is the world going to put together a multilateral international Arab force reconstruction with Hamas still basically in charge?
It won't. I mean, I know there was a meeting that Secretary Blinken had with several of his counterparts when he was on this last trip, and that's one big hesitation. But this is part of the problem. I was talking to somebody who just stepped down from the Israeli government, a technocrat, somebody who's been in for a long time. He was frustrated because what he said is there have been discussions about what's a pathway forward, but he's been blocked also by the political leadership in Israel, who's been unwilling to actually clarify the answer to the question that many people have raised, and President Biden, I think, did it early on. How does this end? How do you not make the same mistakes that the United States did in Iraq and Afghanistan? And it's not for lack of trying, but to find a pathway of after you clear, and Khalid is correct in terms of how he characterizes the destruction in Gaza. We're talking at least right now 7 years of rubble clearing, according to experts. 7 years. So people's mentality really need to shift. Yes, it's an urgent moment right now, but we're talking about, if we're going to get serious, after the war ends, a long-term effort. But right now, there's no real discernible ramp for the reasons your question indicates, but also because of lack of clear planning from the Israelis themselves to clarify exactly for their own people in Kogat, in IDF, what it is, who's going to hold these areas, what sort of force because part of this clans and tribes thing, I think when 100 plus people were killed, that was a test case of delivering aid through those systems. And if you don't have governance, if you have essentially Mogadishu on the Mediterranean in Gaza, then you're not going to be able to flood the zone with any of these things. And some of us, like at Wilson Center, has a plan coming out next week. Some of us are convening in a couple of weeks to talk about these issues. But unless you have leadership in all of these countries who are willing to say, okay, we're going to take these risks and put resources in, we're going to be stuck. And I think it starts first and foremost with Israel trying to define the end game of its operation plan here.
Maybe ambiguity is the point here on the Israelis, but let's go to Professor Atesh and keep thinking about your question.
Thank you. I want to continue with actually where you just left, Endgame. And one of the things that doesn't come up in the discussion much is the religion. When we talk about Houthis, we talk about apocalyptic dimensions of it, the messianic dimensions of it. I want you guys to talk a little bit about the role of religion in complicating this conflict on the Israeli side. Because when we talk about the Muslims, it's always, we talk about, they are fanatics, they are Hamas, they are Houthi. Religion, Iran, mullahs is complicating this, but we do not. We talk about Israel as a very rational actor. And I wanted you to address this issue. Is this really the case?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I've been saying for many years now that the growing extremism, both religious but also secular, in Israeli society and politics, is one of the most underanalyzed issues in the industry of Middle East analysis, and there's a lot of that going on, obviously, in Washington. there's a blindness. It's, people identify with Israelis. They don't see the fact that people who were outside of the pale 20, 30 years ago, who could not be part of Israeli politics, are now front and center. Bezalel Smotrich is the effective governor of the West Bank. He is a Jewish supremacist. He is a racist. He speaks in very strong genocidal terms about destroying Amalek, right? I mean, making biblical references that are very clearly genocidal. It's not a coincidence that Netanyahu adopted the similar language back in, I think, October or November, referring to Amalek, right? The nation that the Israelites had to destroy. And so this idea, I mean, the extremism has taken root in the IDF, in the ranks of Israel's fighting force. You could see that in the videos that IDF soldiers are posting themselves. They very often use kind of religious terminology. The Israeli West Bank battalion that was sanctioned and then unsanctioned by the administration is an ultra-Orthodox battalion, and it was sanctioned because of its gross human rights abuses. So there is this kind of extremism that has taken hold in Israeli society and politics that I think is completely overlooked. People are acting as though this Israeli government is just like any other Israeli government.
Yeah. If I could add to that, 3 quick points is that extreme sort of religiosity, right-wing inside of Israel, has this symbiotic relationship, I think, with similar extremist forces on the other side, if you will, and they sort of feed off of each other when more moderates are sort of left out in this. The second point, and it relates to your point on the Abraham Accords, I remember, do you remember, it was Ben Gvir who did the walkabout on the Temple Mount last year. I remember calling up a friend of mine in Saudi Arabia, and I said, well, what do you think? What might this mean? You have this new Israeli government. I know you guys want to have, this is early 2023. And this person said to me 2 things. He said, these Israelis, they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, which is quite clever of you. And then second, he said, for years, you've been telling us, get rid of our Wahhabis. Israel said, get rid of our Wahhabis. He said, what are we supposed to do about these Israeli Wahhabis? And there's an interesting shift if you go to talk to some of these countries where there's a more moderate attempt at moderation in sort of Islam inside of Saudi Arabia. They see things going in the opposite direction, and that's at odds. Third thing is that there is a lot of negativity on all of this, but I do think there's some interesting thinking, some work. The Abraham Accords itself had a component that had faith, and it's genuine coming from Bahrain, parts of the UAE, to use religion to build coalitions and connect people, as opposed to split them apart. But I would say, again, referring to what we heard in Saudi Arabia last week, for sure, when the Israel-Saudi deal is announced, it's not going to be framed in religious terms at all. It'll be framed mostly, and I think, in economic, diplomatic, technocratic terms, and they'll try to stay away from that.
We've still got a little more time for questions, so think of your questions. We'll go to this gentleman here, and we might be able to take a couple more. Yeah.
Hello, thank you.
Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Muhammad. I'm a senior at Washington Lee University. I'm an intern at the Jerusalem Fund. I have 2 questions, and they're interconnected. So the first one is, you talked that the U.S. should change its policy and intensify talks with the PA. How do you work with the PA, with a government, basically, the Palestinian Authority, that doesn't have approval from within, but also from without? Like outside Palestine, a lot of people do not approve of the PA, but also inside Palestine, especially the West Bank, where the PA can't even save its, defend its citizens from settler attacks. So how do you work with the PA? How should the U.S. work with the PA, with a government, quote unquote, that can't even control anything? And the second question is, how do you work with the Israeli government that basically says that there will be no Palestinian state And today is not 1993. I mean, Abbas is not Yasser Arafat. Abbas is willing to compromise more than Yasser Arafat did. But not only that, Benjamin Netanyahu says there will not be a government. Ishaq Rabin back at the days said there should not be a Palestinian state, a fully sovereign Palestinian state. So on one hand, you have the PA, that is inactive, that cannot really do anything on the ground. And on the other hand, you have Israeli government.
Okay, who would like to start with this question?
The question being, how do you deal with the PA, and how do you work with them? I mean, first of all, the PA isn't the problem. The PA in this entire arrangement is the most pliable actor, but also the least relevant. You can talk to the PA about Gaza, but it's pointless. You might as well talk to, I don't know, the governor of Nebraska. I mean, it's not that useful. He has no say in what happens in Gaza. He has no leverage. And so where he's relevant is in his role, where Abbas is relevant is in his role as head of the PLO, and the PLO being Israel's primary negotiating partner, and to talk about the future of a two-state solution. Abbas is probably the only true believer left in a two-state solution, outside of some pockets at the State Department and the EU. But he's a genuine actor, as you said. He's willing to compromise. He's willing to do things that his predecessor was not. But he's lost his legitimacy as the leader of all Palestinians. I think the Gaza situation has cemented that. But he's deeply, deeply unpopular. So even if it were possible to bring him across the table from Netanyahu or his successor and hammer out a deal, what is that deal worth when it's signed by a Palestinian leader who is quite hated by most of his people inside the West Bank, never mind in Gaza, who feel completely abandoned by him? So you can deal with Abbas and his leadership, but is it useful or meaningful? I would say probably not. And unfortunately, I have to run to another appointment, so I apologize.
Well, we're almost at the end of time anyway, and I'm sure Brian can pick up where you left off, and then we'll conclude this session and start the next panel. We have one more question here. Let's take this gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Joe Auslander, a mathematician. Could you comment on the role of President Biden? And in particular, is he motivated mainly on his re-election campaign? And to what extent does that play a role in his position on these issues?
Yeah, it's a great question, and maybe I'll also try to answer the unanswered question on Israel and how do you work with that government, and then a bit on the impact of the politics here. I'm of the view that, and I talk to people who are at the White House, who are in the meetings, senior advisors to him, for better and for worse, that they don't actually consider these political dimensions and even protests all that much when it comes to their decision making. And it's because when I said, well, what do you think about what's happening, in Michigan and other places, the candid answer, and I think it isn't BS, is, look, these issues are complicated in and of themselves. The negotiations, orchestrating with Qatar, Egypt, and things like this. And the president has pretty much, I think, been clear. And I wrote a report, I don't know if it's back there. There's a report I put out grading Biden's homework with letter grades, but how they've managed the war. And I think he's had his order of priorities. And number one has been the defense of Israel. And people disagree with that, but it's the number one priority. They haven't really shifted away from that and continue to maintain that. Second was to avoid a regional war. Third is to get a hostage deal. Fourth is to get more reconstruction aid in. And fifth is to try to build this bridge to a longer term pathway. But they've been hampered. So I think politics are complicated, but when I read the polls and talk to people who really do research on this, The things that animate what voters talk about these days and will likely vote on are immigration, inflation, abortion, the state of our democracy. It pains me to say that with all of the energy that's out there, and I'm so glad that people are speaking up for Palestinians. I really am, and connecting with them. Wish it were the same for Syrians, Iranians, Afghans, but it's caught a moment. But then when you look at, you bring all of these things, including what we see in the news, it doesn't yet seem to matter in a big way, not just with Biden, but in the politics of what Congress just passed, almost 3-to-1, almost 4-to-1 additional aid, right? At the same time that there's this ferment, and I think there's a sequencing thing here. I think, yes, there's a generational change happening. It's not happening soon enough for a shift in policy. But back to your question, sir, on Biden, my impression is that they're making judgment calls, and some of them are quite flawed, in my view, or suboptimal, based on policy and not shifting in terms of politics. The voicing, which is belated, about famine, the need for more aid, is not a reaction to voters in Michigan. It's a reaction to their assessment of the situation on the ground, that it's awful. And they knew this as early as December. It took them slower to prioritize it, in my view. And it's not a political reaction. I'll close. How do you deal with this Israeli government? You're seeing this sort of play out right now, like literally. Look at Blinken's trip, and they still attempt to deal with it. And some people who want to prioritize the Gaza war and Israel-Hamas war over other issues like Iran and other things where we're stitched together with Israel for better and for worse, they often ignore the reality that the broader playing field, Israel and the United States still is very much linked to try to deal with multiple threats. And the real task, not of politics, but of policy, is how do you elevate this Palestinian question with your partners in the region to actually get to meaningful progress. That's why I think Blinken, I call it shuffle diplomacy. They're really sort of bouncing around in a reactive tactical crisis management mode. And they shouldn't overstate how much leverage the US has. But we do, and we're still seen as leaders, but we often are reluctant to use that leadership. And the last point I'd make is that the pickle that they're in is one of their own making. They entered office with a lot of talking points about the Middle East, and saying we should actually step back from the Middle East. We should restrain ourselves. There was like a boutique industry of people who talked about offshore balancing and America does more harm than good, and sort of like animated the first year of Team Biden on the Middle East. They didn't want to do anything like that much ambitious. Then those ambitions increased, and then they're hit by October 7th and caught in this tactical reactive crisis mode, deer in the headlights. And that's a situation. That's a difficult situation for them to manage, but it's also one of their own making.
Well, once again, we're back to pivoting. So please join me in thanking the panelists.